So this slide is showing you a brief overview of the entire unit by lesson set. And so we've got actually 3 lesson sets. The lessons are chunked into 3 lesson sets, 1 through 6 in the first lesson set. How do populations and ecosystems work? And then the second lesson set, where we're thinking beyond the population, how those populations are interacting together. And then in the third lesson set, we're thinking about the humans and the protection of those ecosystems. And then we move on to lesson set 2, where we start to consider all the living and non-living components and how they interact in the ecosystem. And so in lesson set 2, on the next slide, we start to look at how those interactions happen. And we have a really exciting game that we developed where students play a game as different agents in this model of including wildebeest, lions, and hyenas, and they figure out how group behavior is a factor that determines who survives as these hunting interactions happen in the course of the Serengeti. And what they're able to figure out is that the group behavior allows predators and prey both to have more success than they have when they're alone. And so they're figuring out how this is a factor that interplays with the other factors that they've learned about in the previous lesson set. And then in the next lesson, they're realizing that they've really figured out a lot about wildebeest and lions and hyenas, but there's a lot of other components in the system to interact with. So they start to build a model using Sage Modeler to figure out how all of these components are interacting together in the system, building towards the idea of biodiversity and resilience in the system, alongside this idea of a keystone species, which often is a species that changes to that population have a great effect on all the other components in the system. And the Sage Modeler really allows them to see how changing one component can affect the others by building a mathematical model that way. And then we move on to lesson set 3, where we start to really dive into the human interactions in the system. And what students are introduced to are three actual real proposals for building a road through the Serengeti that they are able to investigate. And so they look at how and why humans might want to build a road through the Serengeti, and they think about how that might disrupt the ecosystem. If you built a road that disrupted the migration, now that you understand how the migration works and how keystone species work and how all these interactions work, you can make a prediction about what would happen to the ecosystem. But there's also these other components that we bring in about the human interests that relate to the road, because building a road brings access to schools and jobs and hospitals that a lot of the communities living alongside where the proposed roads would go don't have at this time. And so students are able to grapple with all of those questions that they had about who gets to decide and all of these criteria about cost and benefit to humans and different species. And so they really grapple with that in this lesson. And then they finally turn back to their conservation profiles in lesson 10. And they go back to the conservation profiles that they investigated in lesson 1, and they take everything that they learned along the way, and all along the way they were tracking what they learned in their progress trackers and thinking about how they were going to apply it to their conservation profile. And so now finally they're faced with a conservation dilemma in their profile, and they're applying everything that they learned to figuring out what makes sense and what makes conservation successful in that particular profile. And that leads us to the end of the unit where students engage in a final transfer task where they think about how adding new conservation lands through looking at the American Prairie Reserve, which is trying to connect disconnected prairie lands across Montana, could contribute to the 30 by 30 initiative by adding new lands to conservation and bringing together everything that they figured out across the unit to grapple with this situation of what's happening there in Montana. So that is the unit in a very small nutshell.